Welcome to week 10 of the course. I had a bit of a lengthy announcement posting last week, so I'm going to do my best to keep this week's announcement a bit shorter. Although there are a few things I do want to touch on that I've posted to the course folder for this week, so we'll see how I do. So for reading this week, you have 3 readings. You have a reading by McDonald, which is an example research proposal. This is to start you thinking about the final research proposal assignment. You won't have a written piece due for the research proposal assignment, so it won't look quite like you're seeing in McDonald's work, but it will take on a similar feel in terms of the elements that are there. You have a reading by LeConte, and then you have a choice between 2 readings. I won't be assigning you to either reading, so you can choose whichever seems more aligned with your interest and post accordingly. Speaking of posting, this is your second to last discussion board post. I know at times the workload for this course seems almost unbearable, so we can celebrate these small milestones. We are almost finished with discussion board posting. The final few weeks of the class are really focusing on your 2 projects, which I will talk about in a minute. So Dr. Carney and I felt it would be best to kind of take a step back from posting so that you could focus your time and attention on your final project. So we're almost wrapped up with this piece. Speaking of assignments, assignment F is due next week. I mentioned this in my video last week. It is a lengthy assignment, and I have spoken with some of you that have started the assignment and you were surprised at just how long it is taking you. So if you haven't yet begun this assignment, I would really encourage you to start looking over the assignment outline in the syllabus so that you are aware of what the assignment entails. If you have questions about assignment F, you can reach out to me via email, but we also are Skyping this week. So I have almost all of you on the book for a Skype conference at some point this week. Some of you are going into the weekend or very early next week, depending on your availability, and a few of you I have not yet heard from. So if you haven't responded to the doodle poll, I would just ask that you check your schedule and find 15 to 30 minutes to squeeze me in so that we can just touch base on all of the work that you've completed and any questions you have moving forward. This is the last class-wide Skype conference session that I'll be conducting, but as always, if there are questions that come up along the way, I'm more than happy to meet with any of you and as a needed basis. So speaking of the final assignments, I would really encourage all of you to begin refamiliarizing yourself with the assignment B. This is an assignment you submitted back in the beginning of the semester to Dr. Carney, and it was kind of the first step in your critique of a qualitative article. It was my understanding that she provided you with pretty comprehensive feedback to help focus your work for the final written piece of this class, which is the critique of a qualitative article. That critique is due 4 weeks from today. So I'm recording this video Sunday, April 8th. So it's due 4 weeks from today. This is one of the 2 large kind of capstone assignments for this class. And the reason I'm reminding you of it 4 weeks out is because it's time intensive. It's a 7 to 10 page paper. You have to do a comprehensive critique of the article that you selected. And as it is due towards the end of the semester, timeliness with your submission is imperative. I'm going to have to grade 15 of these papers before grades are due. So any kind of late work is just going to be very difficult to work with. So I will keep reminding you of this. The assignment is really important because it prepares you for the research analysis exam, or the RAE, you may have heard it referred to as. It's a requirement of the doctoral programs that each of you are enrolled in. So it's something that you all will experience as part of your doctoral classwork. So I do want you to take it seriously, not only because it is one of the larger assignments for this class, but it is set up to prepare you for one of the first large kind of checkpoints of the doctoral process. This is when you and your advisor will kind of check in and see how you're doing in terms of your ability to understand and critique research that's been published in your field of study. There's a rubric that I will be using specifically for our assignment, but there is a department-specific rubric for the RAE. So I would really encourage you throughout your process of preparing your paper for the class to look over the department rubric. It will help strengthen your work for this class, but also you'll feel more prepared when it's your time to take the RAE. If you have questions about the assignment or about the RAE process, we again can discuss that during Skype or via email. So I want to touch very briefly on some of the additional documents that I've uploaded to the course folder for this week. I've already spoken to some of you via Skype for our check-in conferences, and some of you have already emailed me your questions that you'd like to discuss during our conferencing. And it seems that the class as a whole still has significant questions and perhaps a bit of fear surrounding the active coding data. This is entirely normal, but I also really want to remind you that the purpose of this class is to experiment with collection and analysis. So there's no expectation on my part or on Dr. Carney's part that you will have mastered these approaches by the end of this class. We understand that for many of you, this is your first foray into qualitative research. So now is kind of the time to blunder through and make mistakes. So then when it is a high stakes research initiative, such as collecting for your component or your dissertation, you have the confidence and skill to do so. So I don't want the concern over making mistakes with analysis or with coding to paralyze you to the point that you can't even begin coding. Coding, like qualitative research in general, is not linear. It's very cyclical. And I uploaded a document to the course folder for this week that I hope illustrates that. The first page looks at my research questions for my dissertation project. And I outlined the questions I started with, the questions I had towards the beginning or towards the middle of my project, and then what my questions finally were when I was defending my dissertation. So I don't want you to think of your first round of coding as decisive. You don't have to feel like this first round of coding is the make it or break it moment of analysis. That's absolutely not the case. You're likely going to engage in several rounds of coding, so your first attempt does not have to and will not lead you to your findings. When you're coding, just remember not to lose sight of your research goals. So I find it very helpful before I start any kind of analysis to have an index card or a note sheet that has my research questions, my research goals, kind of an outline of my theoretical framework right there next to me, so I can stay focused on really the initiatives I'm trying to uncover with my data that I'm looking at. The reason I think coding is so difficult is because each of your studies is different. So each of you will have a different approach to coding. Coding is very responsive to the data that you have. And it's responsive in that it draws on your individual theoretical frameworks and the analytic lens that you're employing. So I can't really give you a concrete step-by-step process to follow. There's no way that I could, provide each of you with a coding strategy in terms of your individual projects. But there are some hints and tips that can kind of help you figure out your own approach. So in Saldana's coding manual, he gives a suggested coding approach for novice researchers, and that's on page 48 of the manual. And I've uploaded an outline note sheet of his approach to UB Learns. So I took the structure that he suggests for novice researchers and then went in depth based on his description of each of the coding processes and outlined it for you and pulled examples from his text. This is not to say that you must or you should follow this approach. That's absolutely not the case. But for those of you that are just having difficulty getting the ball rolling, this could be kind of a good launching point for you. Saldana in his coding manual acknowledges that it's not intended to be a cover-to-cover read, so it can kind of be difficult to know how to utilize it, I think, for novice researchers. But in his manual, each code has a description and an application section. So you can kind of skim those two pieces of each coding process that he outlines, and hopefully from there determine if that is a process that would work with the data set that you're analyzing. I think it's also important to keep in mind that Saldana is not the end-all be-all of coding. It's the author that we're working with most closely within this class, but as you continue to take more qualitative research classes, you'll be exposed to countless other researchers that have different approaches. And I would really encourage you also to check his reference list if you're looking to kind of widen your view on coding. Before you even begin coding, I mentioned kind of focusing or reconnecting with your research questions, your research goals, all of that. But Saldana also emphasizes the importance of the pre-coding process. And I would really encourage you and remind you of the importance of taking time to immerse yourself in your data and become familiar with it before you begin trying to code or analyze. So transcription is one step in the process. I'm sure some of you have found that as you're going through and typing up your observation notes or transcribing your audio recordings of your interviews, you have kind of initial impressions or initial hunches, questions, ideas about what's happening in the data, even though you've done really no formal analysis. And my suggestion would be to write those ideas up. Even if they're not fully explored through this small scale project, it can really inform future work. So constantly thinking of your research trajectory and what you might be able to pull from this project that could inform future work is important. So ideally, your coding and your analysis begins as soon as collection begins. I know some of you started experimenting with coding as soon as you had written up your field notes, and that's really what would ideally happen in a research project. So as soon as you have a set of field notes or an interview transcript, you would start coding. You don't wait until the end of data collection to start coding. You're coding and collecting simultaneously. Mostly because as you're coding, you're starting to understand what's happening in your scene, and then that can better inform your methods for collection. So they really supplement and work hand in hand with each other. Saldana has a really nice example on page 17 of the coding manual of a format for your transcripts if you're trying to code interview data. That allows you to kind of cross-reference data excerpts with first rounds of codings, second round of coding, initial jottings, impressions, ideas. So I would encourage you to reference that if you're trying to organize your thoughts. Ultimately, the goal of coding is to move from these codes to categorization of codes, eventually to themes and to theory. So it's something to keep in mind as you're working through the analytic process. One other reminder that has come up in a couple of my Skype conversations this week is the importance of alignment. As you're analyzing your data, it's really important that you reconnect with the initial research questions that you outlined. Your questions should be directly related to the methodological choices that you're making. Basically, if your questions cannot be answered through the methods that you've employed, you need to readjust your questions or your collection methodology. It's not such an issue in this class because Dr. Carney and I had requirements in terms of the ways in which you were collecting, but it's something to think about in future research. The other piece of alignment that I was kind of discussing with some of your classmates this week was that between your theoretical frame and the analysis that you're doing. I know we haven't touched on theory too much since the beginning of this class, but it's really important that you reconnect with the theoretical framework that you were wanting to employ for this research study, because that is the lens through which you view your data, and it will then color the choices you make about the kinds of coding processes that you're engaging in. Again, that can be hard to kind of conceptualize, though if you look at the document that I uploaded that has some pieces from my own dissertation work, you'll see that there were a couple of coding processes that I engaged in that I specifically drew on because it connected to my theory. So if I had been employing some other kind of framework, those choices would have looked different. So speaking of that document, it is just rough work for my dissertation. A lot of you have been saying that you want to see kind of the nitty-gritty behind the scenes of analysis. There's a reason researchers don't show you that. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, it's not the work that we're proud of. So I tried to pick pieces that would be helpful and illustrative. But again, it's not something that is polished. So that first page is looking at kind of the evolution of my research questions and the ways in which my thinking about what I was looking at in the scene changed as I spent more time collecting. I tried to include some concerns or some thoughts that I had that informed the evolution of those questions. So you can kind of see the ways in which researchers have to reflect on the decisions that they're making and the ways in which that impacts the final product that you see. The second page is an example interview excerpt. I believe it's an interview excerpt. It might be a class excerpt. And it has some descriptive coding, some versus coding, and I think that was it. So it kind of showed you just the beginning pieces of what coding might look like. I don't have a ton to show you because, like I said, I used Deduce, so it's hard for me to pull from Word documents. Most of my coding was done in the Deduce framework online. And then the last page showed the alignment between some of the coding frequency, the research question, and eventual findings and discussion that I laid out in my dissertation. So again, thinking of each step in this process as building towards that final research project that you'll be presenting. If you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know. Again, it's just kind of something that I am hoping will help you, but if you don't find it helpful, that's fine. You can ignore it. There were some concerns about the cyclical nature of qualitative research kind of being unreliable. Some of your classmates have been discussing their concerns that it seems we just make our data fit whatever question we want because we have the ability to edit our questions. And there's a lot written on this. There is the concern that qualitative researchers can cherry pick their data to kind of fit the outcomes they want. And I would really disagree with that. There's a special emphasis put on doing a deep level of analysis and highlighting any kind of oppositional data that we come across. So while we can change the questions based on the data and experiences we're having in the scene that we're researching, we don't have the ability to manipulate the answers our participants give us. The data is what the data is. So my questions didn't change because I didn't like what I was seeing in response to my original set of questions. My questions changed because I couldn't answer the questions that I initially thought I would be able to. My data didn't speak to those questions. But if you are asking questions and you're getting answers to those questions, you don't get to change your questions just because you don't like the answers you're finding. That's not how this works. So if you are continuing to kind of work through concerns over really like the cyclical nature of qualitative research, I'm happy to discuss that further with you. So that's everything I have for you this week. I'm hoping that those extra notes will help with some of the concerns you had about coding. Really, there is nothing to do but just to jump right into it. keep a clean copy of all of your data, and I think that can kind of help those of you that have that feeling of paralysis, like you don't know where to start. If you know you always have a clean set of data to go back to, it doesn't matter how you mark up your data because you can throw it away and go back to that clean set and start again. That's a good practice to get into anyway, but don't be so afraid that you can't start. You have done a lot of reading and done a lot of hard work up until this point, so all of you are ready and fully capable to kind of launch yourselves into the next step of analysis. I'm really looking forward to connecting with each of you in the next week or so. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. I will talk to you soon.